Hi guys, welcome to my channel and another painting in my watercolour sketchbook. The inspiration for this one came from my recent holiday to the Canary Islands, so in today's video I'm going to be painting a lizard and I hope you enjoy the video. Now, as much as I wanted to get my own reference picture, lizards, it would appear, are a bit camera shy and quick on their feet, so the image I'm using is one from Pixabay. I've printed a copy out to help me with my outline sketch, and I'll list it down below in the description box along with all the art supplies I'm using if you want to go and check them out. Now, as you can see, for today's sketch I decided to draw a quick grid. I wanted my painting to cover both sides of my sketchbook, with the lizard's body on the right hand page and its tail going over onto the left hand page. So as much as this method takes a little bit longer, it ensures not only that your sketch is accurate, but that you can fit it onto your page and have it just where you want it. Instead of using perhaps a more traditional square grid, I used triangles and diagonals, as my reference photo lended itself to this more. The diagonal on the left hand page really helped with the angle of the lizard's tail, and the top triangle on the right hand page was where most of the lizard's body needed to be. And with the outline sketch complete, I then erased those guidelines and marked out a few more details on the lizard's head and neck. Next, it was time to swatch out my paints. My aim for this painting was to create something realistic looking without having to paint in all those individual scales. So I wanted to focus on getting the right colours, but also getting the right values to create contrast and depth. I used the reference photo to plan out the paints I would use, not just for the main areas of the lizard's body, but for the shadow areas and the rock the lizard is sunbathing on too. At this point I also started to think about what order I would do things in, so I had a bit of an idea in my mind before I began painting. Knowing what, if any, specific textures you want to achieve may also help to determine what order you paint things in as well, so it's worth spending a few minutes having a think before you add paint to paper. That said, of course, things don't always go according to plan, especially with watercolour, so you might need to be a bit flexible, but it does help to have a rough idea. So I started this painting with a light wash of my cobalt turquoise, working from left to right on my paper using my size 8 pointed brush. Whilst the paper was still damp, I added in a bit of the lemon yellow and let the colours mix together on the paper. For the lizard's body, I pre-wet the area first before dropping in more cobalt turquoise and more of the lemon yellow, so the colours could mix together nicely without any harsh edges. I used the same method for the lizard's head, so pre-wetting the water before dropping in first lemon yellow and then adding in this time some yellow ochre, just at the front of his nose there. Then, with the base layer of the lizard down and dry, I grabbed a 3/4 inch flat brush to paint in the first layer on the rock. For this, I pre-wet the area of rock above the lizard's tail first with clean water before dropping in some transparent umber. Working wet on wet in this sketchbook is quite hard, as the paper tends to dry pretty fast, so using a larger brush not only helped me paint this area more quickly, but bought me a bit of time. This meant I could drop in some sepia to the wet transparent umber and have it mix and blend together nicely on the paper. For the area of rock under the lizard's tail, I started off again with the transparent umber, but here's where I wanted to add a bit more texture. So rather than pre-wetting my paper as I had before, I decided to do a bit of dry brushing. Dry brushing is where you have dry paper and less water on your brush. I'm also using my brush more on the side for this, so you end up with gaps in the paint, giving you that textured look, and this is really good for rocks. But I go back to using the tip of my brush again for blocking out the more solid shadows underneath the lizard's legs and head. With that all dry, I'm now mixing in some mauve into the sepia to add another layer, more colour and build in a bit more detail. I use a combination of wet paint on dry paper and do some more dry brushing as before. Now that's dry, I'm going back in with my flat brush to add a glaze made with mauve and transparent umber. And as long as the previous layer is dry, adding this glaze shouldn't spoil the dry brush texture I've painted previously. So now the base layer of my rock is done, and I'm going to go in with a size 1 detail brush to fill in a few of the markings along the lizard's tail. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not going for hyper-realism here, so I'm just using my reference photo as a guide to put in the suggestion of some of the markings using some dilute indigo. At the top of the tail I use a more concentrated indigo as this area is darker, and I'm almost using a scribbling motion with my brush, being careful to leave a few gaps in the paint so the first turquoise layer can still show through. Where there are folds or creases in the lizard's skin, like around the legs here, I make the marks closer together and darker, so adding more pigment and less water to build depth. I'm working on dry paper here so that I can get more precise lines and add all those details in. Now I'm adding back in some more lemon yellow. Again using my size 1 detail brush and working on dry paper. I also start to add in some yellow ochre and some darker indigo around the band behind the lizard's neck. Now my first layer of cobalt turquoise had dried quite a lot lighter, so I decided to build that back up and added another layer of more concentrated cobalt turquoise with a drop of indigo in it as well. When I was happy with that, I could then start to add in some detail to the lizard's neck and face, but again I wasn't copying the reference photo exactly, just using it as a guide. For the area under the neck I used a grey mix that I'd made up with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And for the markings on the head I used sepia. To simplify the texture of the lizard's skin, I decided to just dot in some spots using the tip of my paintbrush. I used grey, yellow ochre and sepia to add markings on the head and indigo on the legs. Then it was time to start building up some darker values. I used similar colours to the first layers, but this time added less water. I also started to build in some of the folds in the lizard's skin, and darkened up some of the values on his face. For the tail I wanted to give it more form, so painted the underside slightly darker to make it look more round. I did this under the whole length of the tail using a more watery mix of indigo and turquoise and using my size 8 pointed brush again. To ensure the top part of the tail stayed nice and bright, I applied some clean water and then just blotted any excess paint using my paper towel. And to hype up the contrast, I then added this same watery mix all over the rest of the lizard's body, before going in and adding some more markings using the point of my brush. I also add in here some more markings to the area behind the lizard's back leg, as it was a lot darker here. And I do the same to the area under the lizard's neck. With the paper dry, it's now time for the bit that I think made all the difference to this painting, and that's adding in the really dark shadow underneath the lizard's body. I began under the tail with a fairly concentrated mix of neutral tint and just enough water to allow the paint to move smoothly across the paper. I looked back to the reference photo again for this to check the size and position of the shadow and noticed there were a few light gaps under the tail, so I was really careful to leave those free of paint. I worked the area under the lizard's body in exactly the same way using the same paint and around the lizard's feet, paying careful attention to the edges of the shadow, as these aren't always crisp, so it's important to check back with your reference photo to make sure you're getting it as accurate as possible. I was quite pleased with how this turned out, but once it had dried I did decide to go back in and just do another layer. This shadow really helped to add depth to my painting, but when I'd added the darkest shadow underneath the lizard, I did then go in and add some more value to the markings on the lizard's tail. And I darkened up the area underneath the feet as well. Now with that dry, it was time to turn my attentions back to the rock, and for this I decided to do some splattering. So I grabbed an old bristly paintbrush, used a kitchen towel to cover up my lizard, and began using the leftover paint on my palette just to add some more texture. I also added in some splatters of neutral tint on the bottom darkest part of the rock, making sure again that I was covering up any part that I didn't want splattered. I continued and worked on the top part of the rock as well, just adding in some more sepia. Then I went back in with my size 1 detail brush and used some of that neutral tint to mark in the lizard's eye, and darken up some of the markings. Now I'm going to go back in and add a third layer to that shadow area under the lizard's tail and body, before I finish up with some more detail to that rock. I'm adding in darker values now using the indigo paint, and again using the dry brush technique. Now at this point in the painting is when I like to take a step back, have a look at it with fresh eyes and check back with my reference photo. And I wasn't too unhappy with it, but I did just want to add in a last splash of blue, and for that I mixed up some watery cerulean blue and just added it as a glaze over his whole body and legs. I also dropped in some sepia on his knees and darkened up his shoulder on the other side of his body. This cerulean blue really helped to add a bit more brightness to his skin. But there's still one thing that's missing, and this lizard had a lot of little white spots or markings on his back and body. So for those I decided to go in with not a white gel pen, as that would have been too bright, but a white Prismacolor pencil. I didn't want the spots to look painted on or stuck on, so this Prismacolor pencil just enabled me to put them in and have it look a little bit more natural. I also added in an indigo pencil and used that to darken up some of the markings I'd made earlier. At this point though, I really didn't want to go down the route of adding in too much detail, as that was one of the things I was trying to avoid from the start. So I stopped here with the pencil and instead added some more splatters using my Winsor & Newton white gouache, just to finish this piece off and give it a bit more texture. And with that, this painting was complete, and all that's left to do is to peel off the tape. I'm quite pleased with how he turned out, but let me know what you think in the comments box below. And if you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you aren't already. I'm working on a horse painting tutorial for Friday's video, so if you don't want to miss that, then hit the bell icon as well to be notified as soon as I upload. Thank you all so much for watching, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!